Hi, welcome back to the Heat Embossing YouTube channel. It is Jayne Vaughan here, or Card Days Night, you might know me as. And today this is the second part of two videos that I've made about heat embossing on acetate. So if you missed the first one, I'm going to link it in the description below. So for both of my cards today, I'm going to be using this background cling stamp from Simon Says Stamp. It is a Christmas stamp, so I'm really sorry if you're tired of seeing all the Christmas in July projects. I have taken the mouse mat out of the Misty because these cling stamps are made from red rubber, which is quite thick, so you don't want that Misty mat in there, as you might not get a good impression when you try and stamp your image. So I'm just cutting down some acetate and popping that into my Misty, and then I'm going to give the acetate a little dust with some anti-static powder, which is something that I wouldn't normally do when I'm using wow embossing products because they are treated with anti-static properties. But given that we are using acetate and absolutely everything, dust, everything will cling to it, it's always better just to err on the side of caution. So I've inked up my stamp with my embossing ink pad, and then I've just pressed that down with my air hockey tool to make sure that I'm getting a good impression all over that acetate. So I'm just going to set that to one side and then bring in my scrap paper so that I can catch any of the excess embossing powder that I pour onto my project, and that can go straight back in the jar when I'm done. And I've pulled a rainbow of embossing powders from my stash. I'm going to link them all below. I'll try and pop the names up on the screen as well. And the plan is that I'm going to make a nice rainbow Christmas card. So for each of my powders, because I've got a mix of different types of powders, some are plain embossing powders, some are embossing glitters, and some might be more textured. Each one I'm going to shake it up before I add it to the project, and that's just to make sure that all of the elements in that powder have had a good chance to mix together, and you're going to get a mix of all of those on your project and not just one part of the colour. So I've just sprinkled that on, and then I've poured it back onto my scratch paper away from the stamped image, because what I don't want is for the powder to go all over the image. You know, I need to save room for the rest of the rainbow colours. So I'm always going to be pouring it away towards the end of the image that's already been covered in embossing powder. So I'm moving on to my yellow, and I'm doing exactly the same thing here, shaking up each of the powders, just tapping it over a narrow strip of the project, and then pouring the excess onto my scrap paper ready to go back into the jars. So I love projects like this because they're a really good way of using up lots of different embossing colours that you might love but you're not entirely sure how to use on a project. So it's a great way of using up, even if you've got a tiny amount of embossing powder left in your jar. This only takes a really small amount of each powder, and it produces a really lovely rainbow effect. So I'm heating up my heat tool onto the highest setting here, and then I'm going to emboss it from underneath, because some of the embossing powders that I've used, as I say, have got glitter and that kind of thing in them. And if you heat them directly from the top, it might blow away some of that glitter and some of the embossing powder before it's had a chance to stick to the page. So that's why I always recommend heating from underneath when you've got powders that have got more than one element to them. So again, with acetate, what you want to do is get your embossing gun really, really hot, let it preheat for a minute or so before you apply it to your project, and that way you know that your embossing powder is going to melt quickly, because that's the key to successful heat embossing on acetate, is to move quickly. Don't linger on the acetate for too long, because that will cause it to warp. So get your embossing gun nice and hot, and then just keep moving. Don't stay in one place for too long, and then hopefully, like mine, you should have a fairly unwarped image at the end. So I have brought in this arch shape, which is just a leftover from another project, but I thought it fitted quite nicely here. And I've trimmed my heat emboss panel down a little bit, and I'm just folding the edges around that arch. It's cut into an A2 white cardstock panel. And I'm just using my bone folder here to really crease those edges, because if you've worked with acetate, you know that it doesn't fold that easily. And I want a nice crisp edge here, and I don't want my panel to be kind of popping up and bubbling up. I want it to be laying fairly flat. So I am adding some thin double-sided adhesive tape underneath each of those folds. But I'm only doing that on the top and the bottom of the card because I'm going to bring in my fussy cutting scissors, and for the sides I am just going to go around the shape of those florals so that they're protruding a little bit from the edges on the left and right. So now that is done, I am going to grab a card base, and I'm just going to get a bit more double-sided tape because it's nice and strong, and I'm going to adhere my panel to the card base, and that will help any bowing that you might have in your acetate, because it's going to stick it down to that flat card base and keep everything nice and flattened down. So now that's most of the card done, and we just need to add the sentiment. So I'm bringing in the little peace circle from the centre of that cling stamp. I'm just pressing it into my embossing ink pad, and then I'm stamping it down on some white cardstock. So I'm going to cover that in polished gold, and I love this colour. The shine is absolutely unreal. But as you will see, I have pressed it a little bit too hard into my ink pad, and I've got a little bit of embossing ink on either side of the word. So what I'm just doing is taking a dry paintbrush, and I am just dusting that excess powder that I don't want away, and then I am heat embossing the rest of it as usual. A little hint for if you do get a little bit of kind of over embossing there that you don't want is just to get a white eraser like I've got here, and then afterwards just rub that away, and any marks that are left will just come right off, and I am left there with a nice clean sentiment. So I'm just getting my nesting circle dies. These are from Waffle Flower, and I think they're called the additional circle dies, A2 circle dies. Again, I'll link them below. And I am just choosing one that is slightly larger than that sentiment, and I'm using my little mini die cutting machine which I keep on my desk to cut that out. And then I'm just going to add my sentiment on with a little bit of liquid glue. Obviously, gluing things onto acetate is usually quite tricky because you don't want the glue to be visible from the other side, but because we've got that card base behind it, then I don't need to worry about that on this occasion. And what I am going to do is get my Big Mama roll of foam tape, and I'm just going to pop a little bit of foam tape behind that sentiment, so it's going to give it a little bit of dimension, but it's also going to stop that acetate from kind of bowing outwards, and keep it nice and flat to the card base. So kind of achieving two purposes at once, which I am here for. So that is the first card done. So it's time to move on to the second. For my second card, I am also going to use the same cling stamp. So I have followed exactly the same process as I did earlier. I have dusted my acetate with a bit of anti-static powder. I've stamped my background cling image in my Misty, and I am now adding some polished silver embossing powder to it. Again, the polished range, I just can't recommend it enough. It gives you the most incredible shine. I absolutely love it. I use so much of it in my project. What I'm doing here is I'm flicking the back of the acetate quite hard as well, because that will get rid of any excess embossing powder that has stuck to anywhere on the acetate where you haven't put your embossing ink. So anywhere you don't want it, give it a really good hard tap or a flick, and that should come right off. So I have heat embossed this again on the highest setting with my heat gun, moving really quickly, trying to avoid warping on that acetate panel. And I am just going to do a similar thing as I did with my last card. I'm going to stamp that peace stamp in the centre of the acetate, and then again I'm going to heat emboss it with my polished silver. I've been careful this time to avoid pressing it too hard into my ink pad, so that I'm not going to get some of those excess patches that I had last time. And I don't know about you, but I like to think of lots of different ways that I can use my craft supplies, so I'm really getting my money's worth out of them. So as well as using the same cling stamp that we used for the first card, I'm going to use this same arch die. So I am just again going to cut that out of an A2 panel of white cardstock. I use Nina Classic Crest £110 for my card bases, and I also use the Wow Embossing super smooth cardstock because it's brilliant for, it's just a great all-round cardstock really for ink blending and for heat embossing and everything else. So I am just lightly tracing with a pencil the arch shape onto a white card base. And that is just so I can mark out where I want my colour to be, because I'm going to ink blend the background here. So I've got 3 shades of Concord and Ninth colours, and I'm just going to go in with my medium shade first. I'm going to pop that down. And the reason I'm starting with my medium shade is because I'm not entirely sure how dark it's going to go on the page, and I'd rather start off lighter and then build into the darker colour, because obviously if you go in too dark in the first place then you can't lighten that up afterwards. So I'm happy with that shade, and then I'm going in with my lighter colour towards the top so it's fading out into white, and then I am adding some of that darker colour in the bottom left, and then I'm just going over it all one more time to blend it all nicely together. So I'm just lining my arch up over the top to make sure the ink blending is where I want it to be. And then I am just testing out where I want my heat embossed image to go as well, where I want it to line up with the arch. I'm quite happy with how that looks, so I'm going to stick everything down. But first I need to grab an eraser and just get rid of that pencil line around the edge to make sure that it's not visible. So I'm going to adhere my panel in place with some liquid glue. So I'm just going to apply that all around the edges of my arch, and then I'm going to place it down on top of my heat embossing so I can see exactly where I want it to go. And then once that's done, I'm going to flip the whole thing over and I'm going to add a bit more liquid glue and add that on top of my card base. Then all that's left to do is just to trim the excess acetate with my trimmer, and that finishes up our second card. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I actually really like that second card. I think that's probably my favourite out of the 2. But let me know in the comments which one is your favourite. And if you'd like some more ideas about embossing on acetate, then check out the first part of this video as well, which I'll have linked down below. And hopefully I'll see you all again soon. Thanks for joining me. Bye.